Hi there, I'm Tom Spencer. This week on Central Texas Gardener, find out how to cover the ground in shade to replace lawn or spark attention in low light. On tour, visit a creative bottle world that united art, plants, and healing during times of trauma. Daphne answers your top question and makes her pick of the week. And Merrideth Jiles shows off plants that beat both drought and freeze. So let's get growing right here, right now.
Support for Central Texas Gardener comes from GeoGrowers, offering custom soil blends for lawns, gardens, xeriscaping, and organic landscaping supplies. More information at geogrowers.net.
How can a garden help you heal? On tour this week, see how a creative bottle world united art, plants, and personal growth to bring celebration and renewal into times of trauma.
Elayne Lansford's Bottle World is a tribute to triumph over life-threatening illness and the power of healing through gardening. Reframing her reality by giving new life to old objects helped her when husband John Villanacci faced a random disease and lung transplant soon after she recovered from breast cancer. It was a twist for Elayne, a psychologist who helps clients every day. When she built a secondary office near the Bottle World, they can travel her path of serenity through rebirth.
I love being in the country, I love being outside, I love having a garden, and I thought that it would be a kind of a wonderful compromise to have a little office out here where I could at least see some of my clients.
Her certified backyard habitat started closer to the house on land that had belonged to her grandmother.
And I didn't really start out with any grand plans, they just evolved over time. The area here is more the entertaining area. I have a little tiny house with not a lot of room, so if I have parties, I always have garden parties.
Later, they added a pond.
The sound of water is such an amazing and wonderful thing. And our style was, much more to think of something like a pond than we weren't pool people. And also the wildlife can make use of it. And the pavilion came when I had gone on a trip to Bali and saw that all the Balinese people spent most of their time in these beautiful pavilions outside of their houses.
She enclosed little nooks to view the wild field beyond the tamed garden, where 70-year-old agaves stand out against native wildflowers she planted. During her cancer treatment, Elayne carved out a meditative cove inspired by one created by author and designer Jill Noakes in her home garden.
I wanted the idea of something that was circular and very quiet and ultimately would be surrounded by some kind of greenery. I had the garden at that time, or had parts of it, but what I found is that it was so important in being able to help me heal. If I could come out here and work and be outside, it just, in some way, it helped me to be able to go on and to get better.
During Elayne's recovery, John built her the first bottle tree on the path to the field, a symbolic transition from control to what is sometimes beyond our control.
I'd seen one when I was young, and it was one of those things that I always wanted to have. It kind of became the energy center of the garden. The other thing that, though this certainly wasn't something in the forefront of my consciousness, but originally bottle trees came from Africa, and bottles were put on stakes in Africa to catch evil spirits and keep them away from people's houses. So there is a possibility that at some level, if there were lots of bottles out there, they might keep some of the bad energy away from the house.
Later, she saw a bedspring arbor that drafted a new idea. To help her through John's illness, a friend erected one for her to bottle with elegance. Elayne has always found creative ways to recycle, like this abandoned satellite dish she found.
I think it started because I have always loved industrial objects that seem beautiful somehow. So I liked getting weird industrial objects that had beautiful shapes. And something about the glass just appeared to complement them. They all seem to go together. And it's sort of contagious. You know, once one starts doing one thing, then other possibilities start coming up. They come from all sorts of places. I grew up on a farm that had been around since the 1880s, so there was a huge abundance of old farm equipment that was just laying around, and I probably got my sense of the industrial aesthetic from the old equipment.
An uncle recalled that a windmill at the family farm had blown off in the tornado of 1961. They rescued it from overgrown cedar trees and restored it to stature. At first, friends welded Elayne's structures for her, but she wanted to be totally immersed in the creative process.
I love to do things with my hands, and I guess like many people who their main vocation, they use their mind. They want something different to do in their avocation. And one day out in the hill country, I saw that someone had made this particularly elegant bottle tree. And I just love that bottle tree, and thought if I could learn how to weld, then I could make all the bottle trees that I wanted. So I decided to take a introductory welding course at ACC. And thanks to the fabulous instructors and their enormous patience, I can weld in a very rudimentary way. And basically then it was just a matter of thinking up ideas of things that might look neat and figuring out how to weld them and putting bottles on them. I gathered a lot of bottles by the side of the road. I would just walk up and down the country roads, and every now and then somebody would throw out a really cool bottle, and I'd take it home and wash it and put it on a stake, and there it was. When the drought was so bad and everything was dry and dying, it was kind of lovely because the bottles were still in bloom. And that's true in the winter too.
From thrift stores, family, and friends, her collection and ideas keep growing. Elayne removed invasive plants and added natives that support wildlife.
And at some point, the bottle world started being an alternate reality where I could get some comfort since regular reality wasn't so good. But once he got transplanted and we kind of got through all of that, I think it became a place of celebration. And that's when it really began to grow. And I think I kind of worked out some of my sadness and anger and sorrow just by going out and creating more garden. I think we all need refuge, and we all need sanctuary, and we all need peacefulness. And as the world is busier and busier, everybody has the capacity to do that in some little way if they care about gardening. I mean, that's one of the joys of it, and it's available to everybody. It's not something that one has to be wealthy to do.
Thanks, Elayne, for sharing your garden with us. And now we're going to be talking about some great ground cover plants for Central Texas and beyond. Joining me is Michelle Pfluger from Green and Growing Nursery in downtown Pflugerville.
That's right, we have a downtown now.
It was great to have you on the program. You're part of Texas history. You're one of the Pfluger family from Pflugerville, so that's great. And you're a real native plant enthusiast.
I do. I love native plants. That's something my mother, who's also part of the nursery, really has shared with me, and we just really emphasize native plants in the landscape and using these plants.
Well, there's a lot of good ones here that are native, some introduced species, but everybody's looking for alternatives to turf right now.
Yes.
Anything.
Huge.
Anything. Thank you very much. And we have a lot of cool things to talk about, so let's dive in. Mountain pea is a little plant right here. And I have to say, I was unfamiliar with this plant until fairly recently, but where I work, there's a large bed of it planted, and it's spectacular.
Yes, it really is. This is one that's been fairly recently introduced into the trade. And if you've seen it, there's some great installations of it around town. It makes a really dense, dark green ground cover. It's evergreen, except in really hard winters. And the bright purple flowers in the summer are just very attractive. It's a great one.
Very hardy.
Very.
Very low water use.
Very.
grows only about, that I can see, about a foot tall.
About a foot is the very tallest, and it's normally a little bit shorter, but beautiful. If you want a lush green effect, that's a great one for that.
Yeah, so mountain pea, again, is the common name, and people should be on the lookout for it. Great in mass plantings.
It is beautiful in large mass
Swaths,
plantings. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Now, people don't associate ferns with the Edwards Plateau that much.
They don't.
But here is a gorgeous one. This is called wavy cloak fern.
This is.
And, you know, I have seen this growing out in the full sun on limestone.
You have, yeah. If you've hiked in the hill country or been to some of the state parks, you might have seen this fern and a lot of related species. This is the most common one. But this one will get about 1 to 2 feet tall. It can go in quite a bit of sun, but it also can grow in partial shade. And it likes to be in dry, well-drained areas, which is very unusual for any fern.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to just highlight here is on the back side of this, you get that silvery effect on the foliage often that is just really lovely.
It's a beautiful fern.
Yeah,
I
really
that
love
plant.
it. And, you get that xeric plant, but with that kind of woodlands look.
Yeah, a lot of people, they want the dryland, they want plants that can go dry, but they also want plants that look lush and full, and that plant really helps provide that look and kind of that wood fern that we think of with woodlands.
Yeah, right. Well, the next plant is called snake herb, not for any reptilian reasons. I don't know why it's called that, but this is one that you say makes a great ground cover.
Great ground cover. This one's really east of 35 in the Blackland Prairie area. This is going to be a fairly common plant you would find in grasslands. But it can grow along forest edges and shadier spots as well. It's very thick. It's a very rapid grower, really good spreader. You better want it. Beautiful.
I like plants like that.
Yeah, they're great. If you need to cover some ground, it does incredibly well through drought too. Beautiful purple flowers in the spring through about June, July. The hummingbirds really like them too. And they're, lovely.
It's a tubular kind of flower?
It is. It's a little purple tubular flower about that long.
About an inch long.
Up
Wow,
and down the
okay.
stems, and it's really lovely in bloom. And it's just a very thick green mounds. It's really beautiful in large masses.
Okay, so again, snake herb.
Snake herb.
And I don't think we've ever talked about it. It's a great looking plant. Behind it, we have a Mexican spiderwort, which is a new introduction. And the spiderworts are spectacular in our
They
region.
are. And this one is out of northern Mexico, and it's one of those great little plants out of that region that really does well around here. It will reseed and move around the yard a little bit, but it's very easy to pick out if you don't like it.
Right.
But I love the purple polka dotted foliage, and the little purple flowers are very great in the landscape. And it can take, it does very well in dry areas. If we get very dry like we did in the drought the summer before last, mine did go summer dormant, but they came back with the rains and have done great.
Okay.
So that's a neat textural foliage color plant.
Well, and sounds like very well adapted for our region.
It does great.
And right next to that, we have one of its cousins,
Yes.
which is cobweb plant.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite ground covers for dry shade. It's very drought tolerant. It does the beautiful kind of silver foliage, the purple flowers through the summer months, very compact, and does very, very well around here. And people aren't really familiar with this plant, and great texture in the garden as well.
Well, I'm crazy about all the plants in that family, I think.
Yeah.
And the flowers are so bright and just keep blooming and blooming and blooming.
All the time. Mine normally in my yard is blooming from March through sometimes December.
Okay, so again, cobweb plant is the name of that.
That's cobweb.
Hill country sedge. I love the sedges. These are tough as nails.
They are. They're some of the best ground covers for air, especially if you're wanting an evergreen ground cover under trees. This is something you're going to see throughout Texas woodlands. There's a lot of different species. This is a hill country sedge, and it makes a nice evergreen ground cover.
Yeah.
There's not much more you can say about it.
Fairly drought tolerant.
Yeah, they're very good.
And just a really terrific grassy, soft look. If you really want to soften up that, if you live out on especially on the Edwards Plateau, and you have cedars and lots of oak, and you have bare ground, you want something to grow, this is a great plant for
Yeah,
it.
and that's where you'll see it a lot growing naturally too,
Yeah,
and it's a
right.
great, and it's perfect for it.
Well, there's a fragrant mist flower is our next plant, and this is one that's not your typical mist flower. This is one that only you are propagating.
In this area I seem to be. This is a really neat one native to South Texas, and it's more of it's not really a ground cover, it's more of an understory plant. It likes to weave up through shrubs and trees and bloom. in the fall with the monarch migration primarily.
Okay.
Very drought tolerant, and it is a beautiful, beautiful flowering plant for woodland areas.
You know, a lot of these mist flowers can be a little bit rambunctious. Is this one?
This one doesn't have a spreading root system, so it stays in
Okay.
place really well, but it is, you know, it's a rambler, so it will go up and out and around, but it doesn't really go out like the Greg's,
Okay.
which it does.
Yes, right. But beautiful plant and great for the wildlife, obviously, with the hummingbird migration. And one that is, again, a new entry in the Texas natives, which is wonderful. Right next to it's an old favorite, but I wanted to include it because this is so dependable for those woodlands and shady areas, and makes a great ground cover if you seed it out heavily.
You're right. It's absolutely one of my favorite flowering plants for shady areas.
Salvia coccinea, or tropical sage, is a common name often applied.
And it is one. And you can also find, as you were mentioning earlier, in white and pink versions that are really lovely. This is the typical red version you would see in South Texas. It will reseed and spread around the yard, and also that's also makes it make a great ground cover. And that's a beautiful one, and hummingbirds love it, and great color in the yard.
Yeah. And, you know, it's a dependable perennial and can actually be mowed. And if you do it just once or twice a year.
Yeah, you absolutely, and that helps thicken it up and branch it out
Yeah,
more.
right,
Looks great.
Well, the next plant is a manfreda, which, again, for ground cover and dry shade, it doesn't get much better than this one.
It is really great. And this is specifically the silver leopard, and it has a wonderful purple polka dotted foliage. The other things, it has a really neat flower spike in late spring that'll come up that's creamy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's neat.
Alien-looking flowers.
They are alien looking, and they have huge nectar droplets, which you might notice if the hummingbirds don't get to them first. But that's a wonderful plant. I like to use as a small-scale ground cover as an accent plant with other ground covers. It's one of my favorites.
And they can take some sun.
Absolutely,
and, or shade. They're happy in either one, it seems.
They are. They're really just one of those very easygoing plants. And they're really great, I think, for those areas where you get shade and then you get blasted by some sun at different times of the day, which can be challenging.
Right. Yeah, more than a little challenging. But I recommend nearly all of the different variants of the manfredas, also sometimes called false aloes, just terrific plants. Now, the next plant that you brought along is one of the aspidistras. And this is one that I've gardened with in the past. I love aspidistra. I mean, you need a plant that grows in the dark.
Yes.
Occasionally, right? Something in the dark corners.
And that is the only place aspidistra does well. It is very sensitive to sunlight. It will burn.
This one is particularly sensitive.
Yeah,
I
and
think.
this one is in particular, but it has also these wonderful speckled leaves, which give you a little bit of color. But for really, really heavy shade, where other plants just don't do well, the aspidistras are fantastic. And specifically, the Milky Way is one of my favorites. It's a little bit lower growing than the typical cast iron plant.
Yeah, right.
Which is nice too.
And they're colonizing. They'll slowly spread out.
Yes.
And they're super dependable. You know, even in the drought last year, I only had to water some of the I have large swaths of aspidistra in my current garden. I think I watered them twice, you know.
Yeah, when they're well established, they're very drought tolerant, and they can really hold their own with native plants in that regard.
Real briefly, we want to mention the last plant you brought along. I'm intrigued by this, African hosta.
Yeah, I brought it because it's just a great replacement for the hosta when you're wanting something with that wide leaf, but something that's drought tolerant. It's a bulbing plant, and it also have a little white flower in the spring that's quite pretty. But the foliage is really great. It makes a great little small-scale ground cover, or a little special contrasting plant with some of your other ground covers, and it is quite drought tolerant.
Yeah, well, if people could, it's got a waxy leaf, which is a tip that it's got drought tolerance, and real interesting above ground corm or bulb.
It does, and it's a wonderful plant to grow, and it is easily divided and shared and moved around the yard, which I think is a neat trait in a plant.
Yeah. Well, lots of cool things to talk about, natives and cool introduced species. Michelle Pfluger, thanks so much for being our guest.
Thanks for having me.
And I hope folks will check you out at Green and Growing in downtown Pflugerville. I like saying that.
We have a downtown now.
All right, thanks so much. And
Thank you.
coming up next is our friend Daphne.
Hi, I'm Daphne Richards. We've got another great question this week about soil. Why do we firm the soil around new plants? And if firming the soil is good, why are we not supposed to walk through our garden beds? When digging a new hole for a plant, you're basically destroying the soil structure in that area, so you want to put it back as close as possible to the way it was. Tilled soil has increased fluffiness and larger pore space, which increases the space for air in the soil, which is not necessarily a bad thing, especially for a new planting. But those larger air-filled pores are too large to hold on to water, which could very well be the kiss of death for a new transplant in a very short time. That's one reason why you should water new transplants every day, if not twice a day, for a while. This is about more than just the plant's lack of roots. It's about the soil settling and the pore space decreasing over time. Once the soil is settled back to the way it was before you dug your hole, it'll begin to get back to the natural structure and water-holding capacity that it had due to its natural texture, which is dictated by the amount of sand, silt, and clay and organic matter that makes it up. If you've heard of no-till farming, you're familiar with this concept. Disturbing the soil structure as little as possible, except obviously in the planting hole, is best for overall soil structure and overall health. But there's also soil compaction to think about. If the soil's walked on extensively or driven on, in the case of construction with heavy equipment, the pore spaces are squeezed together, leaving no space for air and eventually no space for water either. Obviously, plant roots need water, but they also need oxygen to breathe and be able to take up the water and life-giving nutrients that are in the soil. Compacted soil also becomes very hard, making it almost impossible for roots to push out into it. And when roots can't grow, the rest of the plant's growth is also impeded. Lack of rainfall, especially if you're unable to irrigate, also leads to soil compaction. Like a sponge when it dries out, your soil shrinks in on itself, decreasing pore space and making it very hard to re-wet without squeezing it. And I don't have to tell you that you can't squeeze your soil. During the extended heat and drought of 2011, Central Texas soils became very compacted, adding yet another stressor to plants, especially in natural areas where there was no way to irrigate them and alleviate the problem. So soil compaction should be avoided at all costs. Our plant this week is agarita, Mahonia trifoliolata, also known as Berberis trifoliolata. This rounded shrub has leathery, spiky, holly-like foliage, only the leaves are more gray-green than the deep green of hollies. It's evergreen and has no problem surviving our winters or our summers here in Central Texas. This plant is as tough as it looks, and although it thrives in the full sun, it also does just fine in a bit of afternoon shade. It can get a little monstrous, up to 6 feet tall and wide, and even bigger if rain's plentiful, so give it plenty of room to spread. The delicate yellow flowers of agarita appear in late winter and cover the plant from February till as late as April, depending on how cold our winter is and how late our last frost arrives. The flowers are followed by bright red berries from about May through July, which are a great source of food for any wildlife and birds in the area. You can also harvest the berries and use them to make jelly. We'd love to hear from you, so please visit klru.org/CTG to send us your questions or plants of the week from your garden.
Thanks, Daphne. Now let's check in with Merrideth Jiles for Backyard Basics.
Howdy, y'all. Merrideth Jiles here with Backyard Basics. As Scott and Lauren said, 2011 was a double spanking year for the plants. February of 2011 saw the worst freeze in 35 years, and all of 2011 was a terrible drought. So what plants made it through both of these things without any issues? Now here's my situation. I'm in East Austin, just east of I-35, and I stopped watering in April of last year because I knew it was going to be a bad drought and I didn't want to be out there all the time. So here's a few of the ones that did well for me. Nearly all of my shade trees made it just fine. They did look like they were suffering, but they seem to have pulled through. Now that we've gotten some moisture, they look great. Some smaller trees that did great, the Weisach tree, one of the native acacias, it did great. Another one that you don't see nearly as often, an olive tree, Olea europea. Mostly fruitless varieties are what you're going to find in the nurseries, but there are fruiting ones available. Also, the Arizona cypress, a beautiful evergreen. The Texas smoke tree is another one that really performed well. And finally, the Mexican buckeye. Now moving down to some smaller shrub type stuff, we have some old favorites like the Texas sage. Another one you don't see nearly as often, the compact strawberry tree, a relative of our native madrone, but much easier to find and much easier to get in the ground and take care of. Chaparral sage, Salvia clevelandii. And also the Jerusalem sage. This is one that I thought for sure would freeze down and for sure would not make it through the drought. Survived both of them with no problem. Moving on to some smaller plants, most all of the agaves, yuccas, and their relatives did fine. Now you do want to make sure and check hardiness zones. Some of the agaves you'll find in nurseries are zone 9 and they may have struggled with the cold. Most of the yuccas, hesperaloes, dazzlerians did fine. Another one I really love has been the globe mallow. This plant has done wonderfully in my yard. It was actually planted in March of last year, and like I said, I stopped watering in April. It's performed wonderfully. The Blackfoot daisy. This is one you see growing native all through the hill country, does well with no irrigation at all. Right next to it, a lot of times, you'll see the four-nerve daisy, another great little perennial plant that does awesome in our Austin climate. A great way to replace your lawn would be with a plant like Texas sedge, a native small grass that you can mow, you can walk on, and performs really well even in the cold and the drought. So these are some plants that did really well for me in that double spanking year that was 2011. This is Merrideth Jiles with Backyard Basics.
Find out more at klru.org/CTG and check out our Facebook page too. Next week, the Central Texas Gardener team gets together for our annual roundtable talk. Until then, I'll see you in the garden.
To learn about today's program, watch online and follow CTG's blog. Check out klru.org/CTG.
Support for Central Texas Gardener comes from GeoGrowers, offering custom soil blends for lawns, gardens, xeriscaping, and organic landscaping supplies. More information at geogrowers.net.